Welcome to the Legally Ever After Real Estate Podcast, where we help you build, protect, and pass on your assets. I'm your host, estate planning attorney Pamela Moss-Garrett. Let's get started. Today we have Spiro Hristopoulos. He is a real estate lawyer and business lawyer. He's going to be talking to us about LLCs and leases, best practices. Welcome, Spiro.
Thank you so much for having me, Pam. I look forward to talking about, the do's and don'ts of leases and LLCs.
Yeah, so let's start with LLCs. What are some of the best practices you have for people, for real estate investors specifically, when it comes to LLCs?
Yeah, the first do, or I guess don't, is to not hold your real estate investments in your personal name. So form an LLC, which is a limited liability company, to own or hold that real estate for your investment purposes.
And why should investors consider putting it in an LLC specifically?
Yep. One of the, biggest reasons to have your real estate in an LLC as opposed to your personal name is that limited liability that you get with the LLC. So, for example, if there were to be some type of, creditor or claim that occurs at or part of the real estate, your personal assets generally are shielded from, the creditors of, for such claim.
And do you recommend kind of separate entities for each piece of real estate, or like holding companies and then separate LLCs? What kind of structures do you typically see?
Yeah. I always recommend separate entities for each really asset, whether it's a real estate or business. Have one LLC that holds, for example, real estate one, you have LLC one, real estate two, you have LLC two, and kind of so on and so forth. In terms of holding companies, I typically will recommend a holding company if there's, multiple owners who are coming together with a joint, partnership of wanting to not just own one real estate, but have a portfolio of real estate. At that point, that's typically, what triggers all right, let's look at having a holding company. So we have the LLC, that's the parent company or the holding company, which is owned by, all of the investors. Let's say there's four of them. It has four owners, and then the subsidiaries, which would be the actual LLCs that hold the real estate, would be owned 100% by the holding company, at least in this hypothetical.
So one of the mistakes that I often see on the estate planning side is people will set up LLCs online, like on a website like LegalZoom, and then they don't actually maintain corporate formalities, and they commingle assets, and they don't have an operating agreement, and then a lawsuit happens, and then they don't have that protection. Can you kind of touch on what are the formalities that people should maintain to make sure that the corporate veil doesn't get pierced?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think that's one of the biggest issues or keys with an LLC is proper maintenance. And what formalities or proper maintenance of an LLC really is so one is each year filing your periodic report with the state that you're formed in. So if that's Delaware, Colorado, et cetera, making sure you're filing that annual report. Holding annual minutes or annual meetings, and then having minutes associated to that meeting. The third one, and I think this is one of the biggest ones that gets, for examples where individuals form their own entity, is not having separate bank accounts and commingling funds from, either your personal bank account with this investment property, or having one bank account that's, has money coming in from, let's say, real estate one, real estate two, real estate three, and it's just one bank account. We want to have that separate. So each LLC has its own bank account, expenses, and rents are kind of coming in and out of that appropriate bank account.
And then what about operating agreements? Is there any kind of tips that you have with regard to operating agreements?
Yep. Operating agreements are, I would say, key, especially in any type of LLC where there's more than one owner. I always recommend an operating agreement, but especially when there's multiple parties. With operating agreements, it's important to um, have a limited purpose for the LLC, for the operating agreement, but for the LLC in terms of what it can and cannot be used for. One, it adds protection for each of the investors that the LLC isn't going to go outside of the bounds of holding, owning, refinancing, managing, etc. Steps that may or may not come through just holding real estate. And then in additional to that is, who's going to be managing the LLC? Is it going to be all the owners? Will it just be one or two owners kind of essentially calling the shots or making the decisions of, what the LLC is to do? And then also, one of the largest, if not the largest, is having clear transfer of ownership provisions. So a lot of times, especially a lot of the operating agreements that you may just pull online or through LegalZoom, a lot of times are silent in terms of what is to happen if one of the parties either wants out or were to either pass away. In those scenarios, it's silent there. So we want to have just clarity if that means their heirs are able to step in, or if it triggers some type of automatic buyout by the company or the other parties, and just having that language abundantly clear.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you and I work on really well together, because I have a lot of estate planning clients who are business owners, and they have operating agreements that are silent when it comes to death and disability. And even if they're single owners, if they were to pass away, it's going to go through probate, and really wanting to make sure that death and disability plan is in place to avoid probate, avoid their business getting stuck into that. So that's super helpful to know. Before we move on to leases, from an LLC standpoint, when it comes to commercial investors, is there any specific advice that you have with people who are doing kind of larger entity formation, or issues that you see on that end?
Yeah, on that end, it's always being extra careful when it comes to um, like additional capital provisions. That tends to occur more on commercial sides, especially if you have like a holding company um, that's managing and purchasing real estate on a somewhat regular basis. Is having a clear provision language of additional capital. So, for example, um, if the LLC is needing to come up with, let's just say, a certain amount of money, and there's not that reserve in their bank account, what provisions or mechanisms will the parties kind of agree to or be obligated in order to meet that threshold? And then having an appropriate, mechanism if a party's unable to, make that additional capital, what happens at that point? And just having that thought out ahead of time, should that event ever occur.
Gotcha. So when it comes to leases, what are your kind of tips for investors?
Yeah, so I think the first tip for investors is really one, and it's not so much, I guess, a legal tip, but make sure you have a good application process and kind of thorough credit background, financial checks on your um, tenants, whether it's a residential or commercial, just making sure you're kind of doing the due diligence on your end and doing it in accordance with, you know, all of kind of state and local laws. Um, but the next step is kind of more on the commercial side, is determining, is this going to be a triple net lease or a gross lease? What a triple net lease is, it's, the landlord is able to pass along the costs of property taxes, insurance, maintenance to the tenants. Where a gross lease is more of like a flat rate lease. So, for example, if it's $1,000 a month, that's all that tenant is paying. With a triple net lease, you have your base rent plus the additional rent, which is that triple net aspect.
That's great. Any other kind of tips when it comes to leases, either for commercial or for residential investors?
Yep. The next, I guess, really important item on, I would say it's more on the commercial end, but it does hit residential as well, is having a clear language around maintenance and repairs and
Mm.
whose responsibility it is, not just from a financial standpoint, but also from, who is to actually, make those repairs, maintenance, or hire a contractor to make said repairs. Those can be a lot of times either not as clear as they should be in the lease or silent, and just making sure the big items like HVAC, electrical, plumbing, roof, etc., are clearly defined of what party is responsible for it, and if that cost, if it's on the landlord side, can that cost be passed along to the tenant?
Great. Any other tips?
Yep. The next tip is really relating to indemnification.
Hmm.
One of the kind of big areas of a lease, and it tends to be one of the more negotiated kind of sections, is indemnification. And what that means is, should a party, in this example, we're going to say, should the landlord suffer any losses or damages relating to the tenant, and this can be either through just failure of the tenant to uphold its obligations, or, for example, the tenant or one of its guests causing damage to the property. Basically, through indemnification, the landlord will be able to be reimbursed for any losses or damages that were suffered by the landlord for the tenant or the tenant's um, guest actions.
That's super helpful. Um, and then kind of on the commercial side, do you have any specific tips for the tenant themselves? Like if the tenant is kind of negotiating a commercial lease, things that they should be kind of wary of or be aware of?
Yeah, I think one of the big areas is that indemnification language. A lot of times, at least in Colorado, you get a lot of landlord friendly leases, and I would say that's actually probably throughout the country. But most times, you're going to see a really heavy, tenant indemnification of the landlord, and there may not be any language in there of, what happens if the landlord causes damages to the tenant.
Oh,
And so
okay.
having mutual indemnification language in there is important. And then also on the tenant side for commercial leases is to consider, trying to get some type of exclusivity for, especially if it's like a shopping center, exclusivity for your industry in there. Typically, landlords are willing to provide that with some exceptions. For example, if like a big box store like a Target or someone were to come in and there is some type of competition there, that tends to be excluded from there. But having at least the security that, for your 3 to 5 year lease, someone isn't gonna, move in next door directly competing with your business.
Well, that's a really good point. Any kind of final tips when it comes to leases?
Yeah, I think the final tip from the commercial side is making sure you have a personal guarantee on the
Mm.
lease, at least from the investor standpoint. Um, One of the, I don't know if the downside is the correct way of wording it, but in a commercial lease, the parties tend to be, an LLC from the landlord side and an LLC from the tenant side. So, should the tenant need to, or should the tenant default under the lease, a lot of times that means that their business or their LLC is just doesn't have that funds to pay the lease. And so what the personal guarantee allows is that the owners of the LLC are essentially backing the loan, or the not the loan, but it's similar to a loan, backing the lease in terms of, should the landlord need to, file any type of claim against the tenant, that they not only have the LLC as collateral, but there's also kind of the owners as personal guarantors to get the either the rent or any damages that were suffered.
And then when it comes to looking for a business or real estate attorney, I'm super grateful. I've worked with you myself on my projects, and then I've sent my clients. So you have been an excellent resource for me and my clients. But for someone listening who is kind of trying to evaluate a real estate or business attorney, what recommendations would you have if they're shopping around to look for?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I recommend anyone that's looking for, assistance on real estate transactions or like lease review, lease drafting, is one easy way is to look at the attorney's website to see if they have, whether it's purchase of real estate, entity formation, lease review listed on there, and also asking questions specifically about those areas during your consult call. Because with attorneys, and you kind of hinted at this, not every attorney specializes in all areas of law. So on my end, specialize quite a bit on commercial residential leases, as well as commercial real estate purchases. However, if someone were to come to me with an estate planning matter, that's a little out of my specialty, and that's where I'll recommend them to you, Pam. So it's doing a thorough kind of research of what this attorney specializes in and making sure that real estate or leasing is within their specialty.
What, for people listening who are in Colorado and want to work with you, what's the best way for them to reach out to you, Spiro?
The best way is to go to my website, Hristopoulos Law, and at the top there's a tab, basically where you can fill out a form, and we'll get a consultation call set up, and from there begin the process of assisting you through your legal needs.
That's great. And I'll include the link in my show notes for anyone that's listening. All right. My final question that I ask everyone who's on the podcast: what is your legacy? What is the legacy you're building, Spiro?
That's a really good question. It's the legacy I want to be able to build is being able to help my clients, take that big step that they're working on. So whether it's on the business side, starting their business, or buying or selling their business, helping them accomplish that and continue their journey to either growth of the business, or if they're selling, to be able to start that next phase of their life. Similar on the real estate side, being able to assist clients to maximize from a legal standpoint their, I guess more so, minimize any type of liabilities that may pop up through either the purchase of real estate, the sale of real estate, or leasing, and then just helping them get to their ultimate goal, whether it's on the investing or business side.
Well, thank you so much, Spiro. I really appreciate all of your tips and the value you shared with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you need an updated will, trust, or estate plan, and you are a Colorado resident, we would love to be your estate planning law firm. Give us a call at 720-706-0036 to schedule your complimentary 15-minute call. You can also directly schedule at lawmother.com/go. If you liked this episode and you want to learn more, you should definitely check out my international best-selling book, Legally Ever After. It's available on Amazon as both an ebook, a paperback, and an audio version. And if you'd like a free chapter, head over to lawmother.com/LEA.